In this video, I'm gonna show you some tips for painting terrain. In essence, I'm finishing off my this thing, which has been a two-part series in how to build the base and build the trees. So if you're going like, wow, that looks awesome, how did you do that? Well, you can check out the videos. I'm not gonna go through step by step how I exactly painted this. I more want to focus on some of the details or some of the techniques that I sort of used or discovered while painting this that could be used on any terrain. So this is not specific for this build. It doesn't even have to be specific in choice of color. It's more about certain techniques that I stumbled upon or used. I've already said that. So more and more I've been appreciating the fact that if dealing with sort of fantasy games, we are in a world of fantasy. A tree doesn't need to have brown or white bark, it could have pink bark. What's to say there's not a pink tree in the world of Age of Sigmar? I'm not going to say there's not one because there probably is one. So let's start with the tree. I wanted sort of here it is. I wanted a sort of blue, dark blue, sort of like a dead tree that sort of it's got moonlight shining on it or something like that. But I also realized that overall it would just be boring if I did the whole thing the same color. So I did everything underneath in a sort of brown orange kind of tone. It gives the feeling of the reflection of the color of the earth, but it also just sort of looks cool and gives it a bit of a variation. I wish I had exaggerated it more. It's one of the things when painting sometimes with acrylics, and depending on what your light is, you're looking at it and you're going like, wow, the color's really bright, the contrast is really high, but it's not really. But that's something that I will take away from, painting this is using different colors. I can have a blue tree if I want to have a blue tree, but also mixing in other colors. In this case, like a blue and orange, they're sort of the opposite. One's cold and one's warm, and it looks really nice. The mistakes doing this is I used too much wash. I did quite a lot of layers. Like I did a dark layer and then a brighter layer and a brighter layer, and it was a lot. The highlights were more distinct, and then I just washed it all with like a purple or something, and it kind of ruined it. Another thing I want to share is using pigments. Pigments, MIG. Pigment here, this is a Vallejo pigment. I've got like a black, rusty red, and a earth sort of sand colored pigment. I tried to put some pigment in wherever there would be shadow, basically. In some places it was just too black. I used the black one, it was just a bit too dark. But the technique of having a color, and then if I want to make it a bit darker, I can just mix in some pigment, or going in and afterwards and just adding some pigment down here. The reason why it's black there is because there's a pigment. The pigment has a really natural way of sort of flowing around on larger surfaces, going in both ways, like making shadowy areas, making darker areas, but also adding like dust, like this light one here, adding dusts and highlights. It looks really natural while using pigments. I made this moss on the trees. It also carries sort of on its way down. There's some spots of it on the rest of the ground as well. I used this sort of stippling technique. I took this is a Games Workshop Citadel dry brush, dipped it in first a dark green, and then I tried to get sort of a lot of the paint out, and then I stippled to the texture, and then I worked my way up with sort of a brighter green, a really noisy sort of goblin green, and then a yellow. All of them with the same technique. Obviously it's not as much of the yellow as the other one. Like I don't want to cover all of it with yellow, so for every layer I put it in less places. I think that the result is I was really sort of astonished by how nice it looks, and it really just looks like moss. Probably from now on there's going to be moss on all my terrains because I really like the look of it. Moving on to the base, the entire build was zenithal primed from the start. I probably should have said this in the beginning of the video, but I didn't. Now I think especially for terrain like this, zenithal priming is a great idea because for one thing, you can use it, the technique. I'm about to tell you about that. but it also just gives you an idea of where it's supposed to be dark and where it's supposed to be light. But especially with this red, this is just a personal preference at the moment, sort of more of a red kind of earth. And I use a color called Heavy Red from Vallejo and dilute it heavily. So like 50-50 or more. And when that dries, all that zenithal priming still shines through. And you get this sort of red, orangey, brown, still sort of three-dimensional, if you want to call it that. It's sort of darker in the recesses and brighter on top. And it's an excellent start. I mean, and this might as well have been a brown or a green or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is with that zenithal priming, like really trying to use it, especially on a texture like this, because it's just so much more, it's just easier. You get a nice finish and a nice texture, a nice depth. And also because there's so many different textures on the build, because the paint is so diluted, it'll stick and concentrate more to different textures. So it's not only the zenithal priming that gives it a certain depth, it also becomes sort of redder in some areas, more sort of transparently orange in others, and the overall effect is, I think, really effective. I use more than just that one layer of heavy red. I also used a really diluted Agrax Earth shade, and I dry brushed it a little bit, and things like that. But as a start, as just to give you an idea of what to work with, go with the zenithal priming and the really diluted paint. With all the stones, and this was part success, part not success. Instead of painting them all the same color, I had like 3 varieties of gray. I had one that was dark, one that was light, and one that was sort of yellow. Initially, that looked great. Then I decided to just put lots of wash on it. And, now you can't really see the difference. But that's something I'm taking away with me as well. Like, instead of just painting all the stones the same gray, to use different grays. It's more work, but it looked a lot better before I put all that black wash on it. In a way, so far, I've been saying pretty bad things about washes. And I think that's more personal for me. Maybe it's because I don't use them correctly. I don't know. But one thing that was great with the wash is this little stone outhouse here that's fallen off. I painted it grey at first and I thought, well, that was boring. So I used a purple wash on it and got some purple stones, which turned out fun and interesting. It's a big piece, and when you look, it's a great idea to sort of step away from it and go, oh, that all just looks red, or whatever it is you painted, and realizing that maybe you have to sort of break it up a little bit. So some of the things that I thought this is going to be sand, I turned into moss, like the purple rock and the green moss. It just breaks things up, makes it less monotone, and makes things just look more real and interesting. Zenithal priming, is great. These skulls, I didn't paint them. I only had a sepia wash on it, and then sort of a dry brush, and then maybe a little bit of green something here and there, just to make them look a bit moldy. But the base, like, I didn't actually paint them with the white or whatever. It was just the zenithal priming. The rat, I just went full on. A brown rat would look weird because everything else is weird. So it's blue and white rat, or blue and yellow. If I would have a Skaven rat army, I would probably not be the guy who would paint them brown. But that's a different story. As I said before, there's some birch leaves. Birch seed, that I used as leaves. I had to paint them a little bit to sort of get them to fit. I used a blue wash from Vallejo, so it's sort of a grey blue. And then put some tufts on here, sprayed the whole thing with a matte varnish, and then it was done. But I really liked the way it turned out. It looks really sort of dark, weird colors going, sort of a bit subdued. Just trying to get into sort of not thinking all too conventionally is what I wanted to show some of my thoughts and maybe inspire you to, because this is pretty much for me the first time where I'm not like, oh, the tree should be brown. Like even my prototype, I was like, brown, it's bark, it should be brown, the rat should be brown, the ground should be brown, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, it's going to be a lot of brown. Stepping a little bit away from trying to just not use my imagination. This can go for minis as well, terrain and minis. Like, do things actually have to be the way things are in real life? Do boots have to be brown? Can't you just have pink boots? It's fantasy, goddammit. Oops. Weep. I'd much rather have a blue tree on my gaming table that looks a lot more fantasy than, just a normal, regular, boring tree. Bye.